going to go over two things. So there's certain nuances to, if you've never handled a blood bag and spiking a blood bag and priming it through, and the differences in tubing. So let me just go through some static visuals, an actual, and then we can have you do some hands-on over here. So basically, the warmer you're going to be using, the quantum warmer, is very different from other warmers out there because it's just a three-piece system, and you've got a battery that's rechargeable, reusable. The controller's rechargeable, reusable, so those are the two things you want to keep your eye on when you do your handoff. Don't unplug the controller and leave it at the hospital or anything. And then the tubing set. And the tubing set is a transfusion set, like a standard transfusion set, but it's unique where it has these integrated warming coils right in it. So you just prime and spike your blood. It's literally a 1, 2, 3 setup. You just prime the tubing set, you plug the controller into the battery, and then the controller into the tubing, and it's plug and play from there. It adjusts on flow rates and everything independently. So when this was developed with SOCOM, it was meant to be carried by a dismounted medic, point of injury, highly portable. So we have a lot of HEMS users across the country that use a lot of the ground blood programs, but it's also the lightest weight and the most intuitive. So even if you're in a system where you have a very low frequency of use, like if I was to divide these two groups, I don't know how many we have here, 30 medics a day or more, and if I was to say how many times are you going to give a transfusion, like I've got a guy on our team up there that gave 3 transfusions in a 24-hour shift, right? So that's great repetition, he's good to go. But if you go months without it, we don't want you struggling over equipment. I think that's, obviously I'm a little biased, but I do this from the clinical background. This is something I thought of when I was a medic, right? Back 30 years ago in Boston, I was like, I really want to warm the IV fluid, and what's the easiest way? The easiest way is what starts in a bag, it goes to the patient, I want to warm it on the way in. Technologically, most other warmers are a cartridge that you have to put a tubing set and prime that, then put in the cartridge. You lose visibility of the flow path because the cartridge really expands the flow path, probably by 6 feet in some of these other warmers. And remember when you were in medic school, the length of an IV versus its gauge is really what matters on the flow. Well, it's the same thing with the fluid path, but the other part of the equation is viscosity. So when you make the jump from you're used to giving lactated ringers to now blood, the viscosity of blood is so much more. So it's going to flow slower. You often need a pressure bag or put manual pressure on it. I know Chief Goodall's looked at this in Onslow, and he's saying 5 minutes, which is most of what our users say, even if they're on gravity with a 16. We recommend you have a pressure bag because when you get some of these medical cases, you may only get a 20 gauge IV in some of these GI bleeds. The nice part about being so engaged in my system up north is I get to see every case in real time with our medics, so it gives me a little bit more feedback in real time. I've heard other things from other users, but we have them carry a pressure bag in that event, and the same thing with an IO. But anyway, it is as simple as it seems. It's meant to be, and since I was a paramedic and a nurse, I can say this, it's paramedic proof, it's nurse proof, it's Army Ranger proof, it's Navy SEAL proof as far as the setup, because it's made to be care in a stressful situation. You don't want to have to think about it, you don't have to want to go backtrack and troubleshoot the system. And if all else fails, which this doesn't really fail, but if all else did fail, that's your transfusion set. If you're seeing aerolites or something that would make you think, I'm not sure if it's warming, you know what? Give the blood anyway. Just give it. It's better to give the blood, and we can troubleshoot it later. We don't have that happen, but if that's the case, that's what you do. It has a capacity to warm. We rate it at 1,000 milliliters of cold blood right out of a Credo cooler. So if you're carrying 1 or 2 units of whole blood, it'll definitely do it. It actually does on a bench top. If we keep it at 4C, it goes 1,080. We have a number of our HEMS users that carry 2 and 2 plasma platelets, which brings their volume up closer to 1,200 mLs, and they still get by on 1 battery. The reason for that is that when they take out the blood, they know they're going to give it, it gains a couple of degrees fairly quickly. Blood's just got a better specific heat property than crystalloids or water, so it can actually gain a little bit of temperature. So if you know you're going to give blood to a patient, take your blood out and just let it start equilibrating while you're getting set up. And it's a very quick setup, but while it's hanging, it's even going to gain some warmth. So even a couple of degrees, no matter what warmer you use, will actually extend the battery capacity of it. But this had a very targeted battery capacity to make it practical for what is given at the point of injury. Some of the other warmers have like 3 times the battery, but it's very rare that somebody carries 3 times the amount of blood product. So you've got kind of extra baggage, cube weight, space setup, so on. This warmer has simply one battery. Simply one button on the battery, and that is to check the status of the charge. And we just push this button here, and it lights up and tells us if it's 3 LEDs, it's fully charged. I was telling the group yesterday, I co-developed this with SOCOM, and one of the things they wanted, which I don't really like in the final finished product of this, is that it's not equally divided on the battery. If it goes from 3 to 2, it just means the battery's less than 96%. And their rationale was, when we're going on a mission, I just want to know when I pick this up, can I give 2 units of whole blood? And we said, okay, if we, is it fully charged? So we made it a very tight tolerance for them. But if this goes down to 2, it just means it's below 96 but above 50. It recharges on a simple desktop charger. It's a smart charger. You can plug it in, it'll top it off. You can leave it plugged in. If the charge goes down, it'll top it off again. It doesn't hurt the battery to be in there. It actually does diagnostics on the battery. It's a very high-powered battery. It's lithium polymer, so to make this safe, it has to have this smart charger. There's no other charger it can work with, but you should never try to jury rig anything. It would go without saying. So the tubing itself comes in this poly pack, and it's sterile tubing, obviously. And one thing about this poly pack is it's very difficult to tear unless you're at the red triangles here. And there's a little slit in the skirt here, so you really want to go to these and just peel it across, and it's a linear tear pouch. It'll go in a nice straight line. If you go down here or somewhere else, it's actually tough. You never want to take a pair of scissors and do it because you might damage the tubing set. So you should just put this in storage. And again, with the experienced leadership, they know how to store this and what kind of pack you're going to carry. But it shouldn't be. Our Army Rangers will punch this stuff up. It's pretty durable, but just try to keep it in a reasonable storage situation. It has 3 roller clamps. That's typical of the dual spike wide type tubing. I think a lot of this is just easier if I show you live here. So your normal tubing sets are single spike macro drip tubing set, and we don't have a filter in it. So blood tubing, even though this is special warning tubing, this is built in the same form factor as a standard blood tubing set you'd see in the US. In the US, we tend to have dual spikes, Y-type tubing, and I'm going to just tell you a few of the nuances of this tubing because it's made for military use. It's got a couple of things that aren't relevant to what you guys are going to do, but you may have a hospital say, well, that's a weird tubing set that it's got a vent, and we never vent blood because we don't have to. It's never in a rigid container. Some of our special forces use a freeze-dried plasma product that reconstitutes in glass. So we made it so that one of the spikes actually has a vent. You open it just like if you're doing a bottle of nitro or something. So in use with blood, it doesn't matter which one of these you spike your saline to pre-prime the tubing or the blood product, but the one without the vent is a little bit better flow because it's not space taken up by the second loom for the vent in there. So it's a little bit better, and I just find ergonomically, it's easier to hold this one. This one's a little bit shorter and fatter, at least in my hands, it just seems ergonomic. You should never really open this. It's not going to contaminate it. It's got the bacterial filter, but just keep that closed when you're using it. When you actually go to spike blood, if you've never held a blood bag before, they're different because they have a very short stem actually going into the bag. It makes it harder to hold on to. Whereas, if I pick this up, is this actually what you guys carry, or is this just a training bag? Training bag. So most bags have an easier stem to get into, but blood bags are pretty much all the same. They're all have 2 places you can spike into. It doesn't matter which one. You have to either peel it up or peel it side to side. But once you peel it up, you got to really take and be very thoughtful and careful because you just want to, this is the point, you want to take a little time out, take a breath, and just go nice and straight in, okay? It's really easy to go in with a blood bag, even in the hospital, and go out the side. that happens, you can clamp it and you can go to the other port. But it's at one point where I would say to you, take a breath, just stabilize and go in. And then you want to make sure you go in for far enough, because sometimes when you spike a blood bag, you know, and you put it back upright and you move, you'll notice like, why isn't this flowing good? And it's because it's got a little ways to go, and if it's not totally in that blood bag, just the side of the blood bag can actually include the blood going into it. Get a little frustrating. So those are just a couple of tips. You guys have any tips from your use of?
You can definitely spike the bag if you're not careful.
Yeah, right. It happens. You know, so if that happens, again, not a catastrophe. Depending on where you did it, you can sometimes just put a Kelly clamp over it, and you're fortunate you usually have a setup. These things are called segments, and these are on every blood bag, and this is where the blood banks can cut and take a sample if they want to reconfirm the cross-match, or if there was a problem with the bag itself. Even if all the blood's gone, there's usually trapped blood in here that they can use. So going down the tubing, the next main difference with blood tubing is that there's going to be a filter. And the reason there's a filter in here is that stored blood reacts differently with every surface in contact. So the most stable it seems to be is PVC, plastic bag. That's why the bags are all the same. But it can induce it to clump, and the longer it gets in storage, the more clumping can occur. You're going to get kind of the best product here. It's what we do with our EMS2, is that you're getting blood fresh for that first 14 days. So I wouldn't anticipate a lot of clumping in your whole blood batch. You're not getting aged blood that's going back into the hospital. So you should have a good flow. Filters are meant to take 4 or 6 units of blood at, sequentially before they really start to see a slowdown in the flow. And really the end point for using a blood tubing set is when you really can't get the flow to go through because you've got so much clumping. But like plasma doesn't clump much, PRBCs, it just really depends on the age of the blood. But for the purposes of 1 unit of whole blood, she'll put it on, she'll run it in there, fantastic. Because you've got 2 leads, you're going to have a roller clamp for each lead, and then the real regulation roller clamp here to regulate the flow. This is the downstream. So when you, I'll go over the spiking procedure. Another thing that's a little unusual on this tubing set is we've got 2 injection ports, and you never admix anything with blood. Like you shouldn't be putting any medications through it. The only thing that's compatible with blood by blood bank standards is normal saline. So you can pre-prime with normal saline, and you can contact it with normal saline. Again, with our military users, we have these in because if they're in prolonged field care, this is the only tubing set they carry. They want to be able to be given antibiotics, TXA, whatever, and they've got their own procedure of how they would flush it and not admix it with the blood or calcium. Then the tubing set from here down makes a change from a normal tubing set, and it's got the wires in it that warm, and another silver wire that connects a thermal sensor in here, in the middle, and at the end of the outflow. And this end of the outflow one is the most important. This is where it's sensing where it's going to lead and go into the patient. And this is really protected from the environment. So even if you're outside in freezing cold weather, it's not going to influence how it's sensing the temperature. If you have an entrapment and you're in the snow, you don't want this to go buried under the snow or something like that. Could potentially change how it's reading, but it's actually very, we spray this with that freeze stuff and test it, and it's really isolated. It really only reads what's in the flow path. The tubing itself, when you're using it, once we prime it, we plug the battery in the controller in here, and it automatically starts to warm. It actually doesn't feel that warm on the outside because just the physics of it, the heat is transferring to the colder fluid, which is in the flow path, which is refrigerated blood. And down towards the end is where it gets the warmest. So when you go to connect this to the patient, you can take this down. We put an extra insulating sleeve here to protect the patient from the warmest part of the tubing. So this does such a good job of dissipating heat. Even if you have this inadvertently under the patient or on it for the whole transport, it will never get warm enough to cause a thermal injury to the patient. And likewise, you know how batteries get warm. And this battery is made very powerful, so it's made to do sequential blood transfusions. So in 10 minutes, you can drain this entire battery. So it actually doesn't get very warm on the outside. So even this is contacting a patient, you really shouldn't have much worry. You don't really want it laying on bare skin, but it won't cause a burn. On the light side, the other side of the coin, to make a lithium polymer battery safe, they have a temperature range that you can charge it. So again, with this system, we take the safety features out of the operator's hands to some degree, so you don't have to worry about a safety issue. But if this was out in a very hot climate and it's above a certain temperature and you plug it into the charger, it actually won't charge because it senses its own internal temperature. And if you just leave it there, when it equilibrates down, it'll just start charging on its own. So there's really not anything you can do to cause a big problem with the system. I'm gonna spike this for you.
Is that is it heating based on flow? So the slower the flow, it'll cool down?
No, it'll always want to keep the outflow temperature at 38 degrees C or 100.4 Fahrenheit plus or minus 2 degrees. So if you slow it down, it stands the heating down enough so it won't overheat, but it stays at that same output temperature. So the sweet spot of this warmer is if you're in the 100 ml range per minute, which is given the unit over 5 minutes, it'll stay right in that 38 degree C range at that 100.2. If you go above it, it will drop the output a couple of degrees C, but it continues to warm at maximal intensity. Not the warmer you use, but there's another warmer that's out there that's been around for a while. It goes into a shutdown mode if it can't get to set point. So this, the one you use, and another one don't do that. They just keep putting maximal heat. So you don't have to worry on either of the warmers that your system uses that you're going to drop too much on the outflow, or more importantly, it's going to go into shutdown. So when you take it out of the package after tearing out these red points, right? Close all your roller clamps, all 3 of them. And again, I like to spike the saline with the vented one because it's a little easier to spike these kind of bags. I have a bad grip from an injury, so that's why normally you guys would just kind of hold it like this. I just have to take a little different grip to it, okay? And we've got everything closed up, and you can actually just go ahead and spike the blood. And again, this is where you want to be very careful and thoughtful. You just go straight in, okay? If this was the blood bag. Now I'd say it's probably 50-50 in the US when you spike a filtered drip chamber for blood to whether you want to invert it or not. Some are very hard, some are very soft, and you can just squeeze them like a normal drip chamber. This one lays in between the two because it's a newer set, it went through the FDA 3 years ago, and there's new standards on the plastic. It takes DEHP, the plasticizer, out to protect children from that particular plasticizer. But it makes it a little less softer than normal. So we recommend to fill the drip chamber and to avoid any air in there, you first just open, the policy here is going to be this prime first with saline. The system itself doesn't necessitate you have to prime first with saline, so other users, it's really up to them locally if they just want to prime with blood first and use saline second when they're finished with the transfusion to get the priming volume out of the tubing set. The standard in hospitals, depends on what EMS system you're in or HEM system, is to go ahead and prime it first with saline. So you open up whatever one you want to do first. You open up the lead roller clamp underneath it, and you give us a little bit of an inversion, and you open it up. In this tubing I've used before, so I just give it a little bit of a push, so sometimes it gets a vapor lock from the fluid going in there previous. And you want to bring it up to about 75%. And you see how I'm doing that? It's basically filling from what would have been the top of the drip chamber. So about that far. In a tubing set that hasn't been used, it will just fill right up, okay? So you just watch it, it fills up fairly quick. Then you invert it over, give it a few taps. And then you just prime it through the rest of the way. So the benefit of what you're going to do here by priming first with saline, if I prime with blood alone, what I'm doing is I'm dripping out some blood. Not a lot, but it's not the most hygienic way to do it. And if you did get a bit of air in there, you're going to waste some of the blood. So when we prime it through with saline, It's actually all set to hook up to the patient at this point. And then when you start your blood, you want to close off the lead you're not using. So I close off the one on the saline, and I open the one on the blood, and then you just open the flow. And hence the blood comes out, okay? So that's how the transfusion gets started. On the tubing set, this is where the battery, the controller connects, and it has its own little protective plastic piece on it. And it's not because this is at all fragile. The squared off edges can actually tear the pack that it comes in. So it's on there for that reason. But when you go to use it, when you're ready to connect, just take this off and discard this. Can you see okay? Yeah. So again, this was made to be very simple setup. So once you're primed and set up, there's caps on each end here, and this has made to have no click or orientation point. It's like a guitar amp, it's just concentric circles. And this is the way you turn the system on. You plug it in, and it does this startup sequence. So what just happened is the lights that I showed you prior for the battery, like this, flashed once red. And what that is doing is it's testing the critical alarm, and the critical alarm function of all blood and fluid warmers is if they ever had an over temperature situation. So if they did have an over temperature situation, they have to have an audible and visual alarm. So this visual alarm that it tested is the red lights. They'll go off in a strobe light pattern if it noticed that the temperature's out of tolerance on the high side, and that audible alarm will just constantly beep. You can disable that if you're a tactical or TENS team by holding the status button that I check the battery for a protracted period of time, over 15 seconds. And the FDA has allowed us with TENS and military users that they can do that. So if your alarm isn't working, it may be that you had that pressed inadvertently. But don't try to do it unless you have permission from administration. Like if there's a tactical team, you really don't want to disable your safeties at all. I mean, our soft teams put black tape over things and disable the alarms, but that's their world. It shouldn't happen here unless you're a TEMS user. And then the controller goes through a startup sequence, and then when it's ready to go, it's just blinking green once every second. So all the feedback to you as the user comes off of these lights on the system. So this will tell you when you're connected, when you're warming, when it's in the set point range, and when the battery's getting low. There's a little guide, it's kind of hard to read, but it's on the back, and it actually tells you the lights in the controller here on the back of the battery. So when I actually want to use it, the next step is I just plug this in here, and it does a quick test to see if I've got any discontinuity, like there's something wrong with the tubing set, and if it's good to go, it just goes with the blue lights, and it means that it's in the warming phase. I don't have any flow going on right now, so it's going to stand down. So you see how it just went to the screen because it tested to see, it tried to warm and it realized there's no delta temperature between the three sensors, so it's completely safe. So if you had this working and you had a positional IV and it occluded, or you purposely turned it off, it won't overheat the blood that's in there. So blood, unlike IV fluids, has a tight tolerance. If we get a little bit high, we can hemolyze the blood. So it's one of the tight tolerances of a blood and fluid warmer. But once it's in standby, once you start some flow going through the system, see how it picks right up on it and starts to warm it? So it'll just go, it takes about 24 seconds for it to get up to the green light. I don't have anything on the outflow here, but and then once it gets there, it'll just show you the green light. But even if the green light's not on, it's warming at maximum intensity. We just did a big study. It's at the green light. That's about as quick as it takes to get it up to the temperature. But when you make a big change, like you open the bolus, you can expect that you're going to see the blue light come on until it catches back up again, go back on green. But it's only dropping a few degrees up and down. And clinically, we just did a big study, and none of our patients are hypothermic, and our pre-hospital systems that use it, so it works well. If it's made for air transport, vibration, and all that, but if in movement you dislodge the connection, you'll see this little strobe light. That can mean a couple of things. The main thing it's telling you is there's something wrong with the connection. So if you just take and reconnect, it should resolve it. If you disconnect it and reconnect it and it doesn't resolve it, it can mean there's something wrong with the tubing set. If I was to cut this tubing set with a scissor, it will do that. It will cut the power to it. And going back to the over temperature alarm on the battery, if this did go into an over temperature state, it will alert and alarm you up here with the tone and the red strobe light. But again, it takes the critical action out of the operator's hands because it sends a shutdown signal and it will stop warming. So to reset it, you just disconnect. With what you're doing, I wouldn't expect that you'd have to have an extra battery because you've got plenty of capacity, but if the battery got low and you had to change it midstream, like if you were collectively at a prolonged entrapment or something and you start to get to a low battery, you simply just unplug the battery in the controller and plug it back in. You don't have to disconnect everything and restart it. That will just do the restart. If you went out of order, like I was saying, typically we want to plug the battery into the controller and then the controller into the tubing. But if I started out with this plugged into the tubing set and I plug the battery in, it's just going to start up anyway. So everything's meant to communicate and not be frustrating no matter what the operator does. The one thing that you don't want to do that can stop the process of the warming before it even gets going is that if I open up a tubing set new out of the package and I don't have any liquid or fluid in this all the way down to the last sensor before it goes to the patient, it can detect that. And it's not an air and line detector, it's not actively doing that, but every time I plug it in and start it up, it does a really quick test. And if it senses it just dissipated heat into air instead of dissipating heat into liquid, it will go into this yellow light alert to say something's not right in here. You might not have primed this tubing. And you can't reset that just by priming it. You have to disconnect to let it reset for a couple seconds, prime it, and then connect it. And I've had it come up one time with one of our early users in Texas that they did an after action after their first blood call, and they said initially one medic on scene with an engine company, all these people were trained, they had a motorcycle wreck, and he thought intuitively while they were checking the blood, the other two medics, that he would just take the dry tubing and get it ready and warm it up. And it doesn't work that way because it's a safety. It won't warm the dry tubing. So even if there's a little moisture in a mostly dry tubing or there's no flow, it realizes all that and nothing bad will happen. So even if I connected this to completely dry tubing and it didn't realize that it's dry, it actually can't overheat the tubing. So it's just got degree after degree of safety that you shouldn't have to be too focused on the equipment. We're pretty happy and proud of the fact that in the 2 or 3 years we've been out with this across all these systems, we don't have any problems with it. I'm the first one to tell you what the Achilles heel of any product is. The biggest Achilles heel of this product is the cost per use of the tubing, and that's one thing that we're working to get down. From an operational sense, it's environmentally protected so that this battery is like an iPhone 10. It can go under a meter of water for 30 minutes even without the caps on the connectors and nothing will happen. The one place that's got some vulnerability is when you take this protective cap off, and if you're out in a very cold environment, a very wet environment, and you get water in here or you have a lot of blood on your hands and you get this wet, when this connects, it can read that as an error and it'll give you the yellow light. And you can correct that by just drying it off, and you can peel this shroud back and dry it off. Once this is connected, you can be out in the driving rain and it's not going to affect the system from working. And even if this was to get wet, like I dumped it into a glass of water, it's completely potted and sealed so the water won't intrude on the electronics and it won't hurt it or damage it to a reasonable degree. But when you clean this, you can use like the toxic baby wipe stuff here and it won't hurt the system. Just don't submerge it. And when you do a handoff, whether it be, well, let's just start with the receiving hospital, I guess. So when you do the handoff, you just disconnect. These yellow lights will go on because it's intentionally disconnected. So you want to protect the battery by just unplugging it. Because remember, this is the only on-off of the system. Make sure you got these two pieces. It sounds like they're going to take this right down.
Yeah, you'll disconnect the IV tubing because their Belmont device will not use this IV tubing.
Yeah, the Belmont Rapid Infuser uses a mega wide bore tubing set. Is completely different. So This is a good stopgap if they are going to put a cordis in or get a second site, but you don't want to waste the blood, so yeah, chances are good you will have the transfusion in. You get the transfusion in, the priming volume of this tubing set from one of the leads all the way down to the patient is only like 23 milliliters. So every tubing set will tell you what the priming volume is. So it only takes that much to go through the tubing once with saline. So if you want to recover the priming volume when we're done with the transfusion, you close the blood side off, then you open this side and you let it go through. You can't, I was talking to Chief here about this, is some systems we work with are so fanatic about the saline issue, the trauma surgeons, they don't even want them flushing the tubing set because they're like, well, I've seen it go from 100 mLs to a liter bag before you know it. And I'm like, I haven't, but that's okay. You know, but if you've got a 500 bag up, just know that when you're trying to get the blood out, that you can't usually clear blood out of a line. You know, you'll get it, like even this simulation, we will, you know, we'll see this change and get a little different in color when we move the saline through it. But blood tends to adhere to the walls of any tubing set, so you can go 300 or 500 mLs and really not get back to clearing it. You know, it's just the way it is with blood. So I think if you put 50 or 100 in, you've gotten the blood product out, you've gotten the most bang for the buck for the blood product. And then you can just, you can KVO it, keep it connected, it'll keep warming, or if you had to give additional boluses of crystal light, you've got plenty of capacity in the battery. The batteries definitely need care in the sense that you never want these to get low and put them in storage. So even on the system here that you'll have for training, when you use it for training, don't ever leave this connected like for overnight or days at a time. It's going to drain the battery. And these LiPo batteries can be dangerous batteries, but if they're made right, they can be safe. So this is a safe LiPo battery, but because of that, it's got a high tolerance or a very low threshold to turn itself off, and it's not recoverable after that. And one of the dangers with LiPo is that if you overdraw the cells, you drain them too low, you try to charge them, they're a fire hazard. So this knows when it gets to a low voltage state, it's just going to go into an unrecoverable shutdown. But we obviously don't want that to happen. And it's pretty simple. You use it, you go back to base, you put it on the charger. This is the charger, it just plugs into the same port that I have the controller in. There's a green light on the charger that tells you the charger's plugged in and active, and there's a blue light. If the blue light ever comes on, it just means it's encountering a problem with the battery. You should unplug it, let it sit for a minute, plug it back in, and if it's still giving you the blue light, then it's a real error in the battery. Then call North American Rescue, and we can either troubleshoot it or get a replacement for you. But we don't have a lot of problems with any of this stuff as long as you just keep it charged up when you're done and don't let it sit. Our military users, it's a little more difficult because in between deployments, then they'll train, they'll put it on a shelf in an uncontrolled environment and come back 6 months later and the battery's going to do a shutdown. So, but we don't really have problems with the civilian users because there's not a stockpile of batteries. You just kind of get what you need and you use it and you keep rotating it. The only other things to tell you about the tubing from the hospital perspective, if you're taking all this down, that's great. It's not MRI safe because of metal. And just because it's got the metal, it's not fragile. Like it won't take a kink and it won't take a crimp. It's meant to have all these special kind of properties to it. Any questions on what I went over with? Great. So if you want to come up and just get some hands-on and kind of plugging it in, and we can flow some through here. I think that would probably be good. We did that yesterday with everybody.